Well, hey everyone, Andy Serwich here from Altera Software, and I'm joined by Thomas Maurer. How's it going, Thomas?
Hi Andy. Good so far. How are you?
Good, good. Well, hey, we had a pretty nice webinar last week where we covered basically licensing Windows Server in virtual environments, right? Um, Seemed like a great webinar. We had a pretty nice turnout, and we had we had more questions in the Q&A section than we could really deal with, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, there were a lot of questions coming up. Which was kind of understandable, right? Because licensing is not a easy topic, and it's always fun to talk a little bit about it.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So basically what I want to do in this recording is just kind of touch on the most common questions that were asked, because as I was going through the question list last week and this week, I noticed that there was a lot of commonality between some of the questions. And I wanted to cover four key areas that I think will answer the vast majority of the questions that people had on the call.
Yeah.
So the first one I want to touch on was the minimum licensing requirements. So the whole idea that you have to license a minimum number of CPUs, you have to license a minimum number of cores. Can you kind of walk us through what those minimums are again real quick?
Yeah, absolutely. So um, you're absolutely right. So Microsoft changed their licensing from like a socket-based licensing model to a core-based and socket-based licensing model. So the minimum requirement you have to license, even if you don't have that hardware, you have to license two sockets with each 8 cores. So that means 16 cores in total. So that's the minimum you have to license. Even if you run Windows Server on top of a machine where it's only 4 cores, a quad-core CPU or something, you have to license it as a 16-core machine, right? So that's the minimum requirement to really have to license. And then if you have more cores, obviously you have to license more, right? So that's the thing here.
Okay, perfect. Kind of to build on that, another common question that I got was kind of around the use of more virtual machines when you're using standard edition licensing. So let's say, for example, you have a machine that's got a single CPU in it, and it's got 6 cores. You still have to license the minimum 16 cores, right? But because the cores in that server are essentially licensed at least twice, they can run 4 VMs inside of that particular host, correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. So since you license more cores than you actually have, you also get more. You can run more virtual machines on top of it, right? So that's one of the difficult things to understand. So that's it's the advantage if you run smaller CPUs, right? You license the physical cores, but since you have to buy more cores than you actually have, you can license them like double the normal amount you need, and that means you can create more virtual machines on top of it. Yeah.
Right, right. Yeah, that's good stuff. So, touching on that a little bit, this kind of builds on top of the question is, let's cover again how many virtual machines you get for each edition of Windows Server 2016. So, Standard Edition licensing and Data Center Edition. Can you run us through that real quick?
Yeah. Well, it's very simple. So if you run standard edition, you get two standard licenses for running virtual machines. And if you run data center edition, you basically can create unlimited data center virtual machines on top of that hardware.
Good, good. The next thing I wanted to talk about here, and this kind of builds on the previous two questions a little bit again. Can you just give us a rough overview of how license stacking works again, just kind of from the ground up, just to make sure it's clear for everyone?
Yeah. So license stacking means that, again, as we said, with standard edition, you get two virtual licenses or licenses for operating systems, and with data center, you get unlimited. So that doesn't mean if you want to create a third virtual machine or fourth, that doesn't mean that you have to buy the expensive data center edition, right? So you can still go with standard, but you have to add more licenses to that. So, for example, if we go back and let's stop talking for cores and things like that. So let's think about if you have a machine and we license that with standard, we can create two virtual machines on top of it. If we license that physical host again with standard, so we buy a second one in that case, then we can create 4 on top of it. So that's the stacking, how the stacking works. And now the question always coming up when we talk about stacking of licenses, when does it make sense to go with data center? When does it make sense? So there is no general answer to that. Since it depends a little bit on in which region are you living, where is your company, and what kind of contracts do you have, and how much do you pay actually for your Windows licenses, because not everyone obviously pays the same. But the sweet spot, I guess, I haven't really looked it up yet, but usually it's around 7 to 10 licenses where it can make sense thinking about switching to data center, right? It's very easy. So you get like the price for the data center license, and then you have to look how many times can I buy standard until I have like more costs than the data center license, more or equal costs, of course, and then it makes sense to buy the data center thing. One thing though I want also to mention is like if you go to a cluster scenario, things can be are basically the same thing. One thing to remember though is that you have to license all the virtual machines running in that cluster on each host, right? Because in theory, one host could run all the virtual machines. So since the license is bound to a physical hardware, you have to license all the virtual machines on all the hosts. So in a cluster environment where you quickly going up 10 to 12 virtual machines or even more, then it makes sense probably to move to data center as well. But it always depends a little bit. There's no like real thing I can say go for 6 and then after 6 it makes sense for data center. It always depends a little bit on that. But
Yeah,
that's how stacking works.
That always seems to be the case with licensing, right? Is it depends. That's
Yeah,
always my running joke.
Absolutely. That's like we always do when we do consulting, right? It depends.
Right. So the last question that I wanted to touch base on, this was probably the question that we got most on the webinar. So when we're talking about Windows Server 2016 Standard Edition licensing, where you get the 2 virtual machines, right? The thing came up to where if you're running some piece of software inside of the host operating system, it could forfeit one of the virtual machine licenses. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding on how this works is as long as that software's role is in supporting the virtual machine environment, it does not forfeit a virtualization license. But if it's a piece of software that does something completely different, like I don't know, like an FTP server or something, just as an example, you then lose one of those 2 virtual machines that you can run under standard. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. So that's exactly what it means. So if you're thinking about like a very small environments, I mean, to be honest, Danny, we talked about that. It doesn't really make sense to run something on the hypervisor itself, right?
Yep.
It should be a hypervisor and it should be a Hyper-V server. But in very small environments, you sometimes want to run something on that physical box because you think it's probably the only way you can do it because probably you can't buy more memory or something like that. But one thing to really know here is, as you said, if you install anything really on that Hyper-V server on the host operating system, which is not really supporting the virtual environment, then, for example, like you said, FTP server, a DNS server, a file server, or something like that, then one of the licenses for virtual machine goes away because you're using that one on the host itself then.
Yep, absolutely. I think just a couple of examples of pieces of software that do fall underneath that category of supporting the virtual machines. That would be like backup software. That would be things like storage spaces and local storage. Anything that has to do with the infrastructure behind supporting those virtual machines.
Yeah.
Well, I think those are the main questions that we needed to cover. And if you're watching this video and we didn't cover one of your questions, be sure to check below the video in this post. We have a whole list of the typed out questions and their associated answers. So it's probably down there if we didn't cover it in this post. So again, I want to say thanks, Thomas, for taking the time to record this short video as a follow-up to the Q&A. And thanks everyone for watching the webinar and this video, and hope everyone has a great day. Thanks again.